So this foster care meeting was on a Saturday morning. That evening, we were supposed to go to a graduation party for a family friend. And the interesting thing is when we arrived, we were immediately introduced to an older married couple who was holding a young baby. And it was explained to us that this couple did foster care, and this was one of their foster children that they were watching. And Katie and I kind of looked at each other like, God, is this you?
Discipleship parenting is rallying parents to be bold disciples of Jesus. God has called us out of darkness. Now, we leverage everything to make him known.
It's time to show our kids what it looks like to walk the path following Jesus, not the wide road of this world. Be equipped, be emboldened to know, live, and stand on God's word. This is Chosen Gen, and you're listening to the Discipleship Parenting Podcast.
Hi everyone, we're Justin and Katy. We're your podcast hosts. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode. So Justin and I are a husband and wife team. We are the parents of 6 kids. We are the founders of Chosen Gen, which is all about outfitting family discipleship. We know that parents need encouragement and they need to be equipped to carry out their God-given mandate to disciple their kids. And so that is where our heart is. That's what this podcast is all about. And we are so excited that you are with us today.
So on today's podcast, we want to talk about adoption, and this one hits close to home because Katie and I have been blessed to adopt 2 of our children, and what we thought we would do to start this podcast episode is by telling the backstory of how did we become adoptive parents. And so jumping way back to when we were in college, Katie and I dated basically from the first month of college through till we graduated. And it was during those times that we would go for long walks and we'd talk about anything and everything. That one of the topics of conversation ended up being, hey, would you ever consider adopting in the future? And both of us kind of had an open heart to it at that point already and said, yeah, I think we would be open at some point if God led us that way. So just saying that as the foundation, then we get married, we start having a family. Our oldest son is just over 2 years old, and our daughter is around 4 months old. And that's really the next time that adoption emerged in our life.
Yeah, I think up to that point, we'd gotten married. Justin went through some real health issues. Then we started having a family. And for anyone who's had kids, you know how much of a huge life change that is. And then we had our second. So we were not thinking about adoption. That was not really where our mind was at that time. And so I really distinctly remember this one day during the winter. I was listening to a podcast. I was washing dishes. I had a 4-month-old and a 2.5-year-old, and I had listened to this podcast, and I came away going, "Whoa, I really feel like God might be pushing us to look into adoption like now." And I just remember feeling very convicted by that and burdened by that. And so I called Justin at work and I said, "Hey, I was listening to this podcast." And he said, "Oh, that's funny. I was listening to that podcast today too." And I said, "Well, the kind of crazy takeaway is I feel like we should really look into adoption and not like, oh, someday in the future. Like, I feel like God might be really wanting us to look into it right now." And obviously, with the age of our kids, I expected Justin to be like, "You're crazy." And actually, instead, he said, "That's really odd. I had listened to that same podcast, and that was my exact same takeaway." And so it kind of left us both going, whoa, I guess we should probably take this seriously. This seems like God's kind of moving. And so maybe how do we start kind of taking steps in that direction?
So the first step we took was just to obviously pray about the whole thing. But then we decided that we should try to at least take one intentional step, practical step. And so we thought, let's go to an informational meeting on international adoption. And so that's what we did. We went to this meeting. And what was surprising is after the meeting got done and we were talking about everything, both of us felt like it was a closed door. Neither of us felt that it was right. And in a sense, we both felt relieved because, like Katie had mentioned, it wasn't the best time in our marriage to be considering adoption, having a 4-month-old in the house. And so we were kind of just ready to let the idea pass and, go from there.
Yeah, and like Justin said, if we're being honest, we were both kind of relieved to let that thought pass. It was like, whew, that could have been a little uncomfortable. Glad we're not doing that. We kind of moved on with our life, and we had said we'd never do foster care. Like, it's just too messy, too hard with a young family. And yet the interesting thing is, over the course of the next season, God brought foster care up over and over and over in our life. And I can't say I was even all that familiar with it, other than it was a messy process. And yet God kind of convicted us that if our reasons for considering adoption in the first place were his reasons, his heart, and they were God-pleasing, then those same reasons applied even to kids in foster care, even though it seemed like a messier route. And so we kind of talked about it back and forth, and in the end felt like, okay, we took one step with international adoption. We can take one step with foster care, go to a foster care informational meeting. God can again stop us like he did last time, but at least we won't have said no to him. And so we're like, okay, fine, we'll go to a foster care informational meeting. And we did, and we walked away from that meeting going, oh my, that is the most intimidating thing ever. I don't think we're brave enough to take any more steps in that direction. And God would have to be super clear with us if he wanted us to.
So this foster care meeting was on a Saturday morning. That evening, we were supposed to go to a graduation party for a family friend. We didn't want to go. We were frazzled from this meeting, feeling just tired and overwhelmed by the whole situation, not knowing what to do. And yet we went. And the interesting thing is, when we arrived, we were immediately introduced to an older married couple who was holding a young baby. And it was explained to us that this couple did foster care, and this was one of their foster children that they were watching. And Katie and I kind of looked at each other like, God, is this you? And so the whole party, we ended up sitting with this older couple, and they answered every question that we had for them about foster care and how it works and all our fears and concerns. And really, we left the party just in a totally different state of mind.
And so that was early summer. That was at a graduation party. And throughout the rest of that calendar year, step by step, God gave us enough courage to keep walking down the path of getting licensed, putting in that application, doing the home study. It definitely wasn't a quick process. It was, felt like it took forever at the time. But it wasn't until, almost to the new year that we were even licensed and ready to have a child move in with us. And another part of the story we didn't even get to share. But anyway, our daughter moved in January of that next year. And she actually is the little girl that couple was holding at that graduation party. And so really cool ways that God brought a lot of things together at that time. And now our daughter is adopted, and she's been with us for many, many years. And so that's kind of the story of what's got us into adoption and how God kind of pulled us there, despite our kicking and screaming sometimes and our fear and our worries. He really kind of brought us to that place by his grace in a lot of really cool ways. And so to quickly wrap this all up, after finishing our long adoption proceedings and the termination of parental rights and the courts and all this stuff with our daughter, we were kind of exhausted and very happy to just settle into normal life as a family. We were no longer licensed for foster care. Life was kind of falling into a normal routine. And then just a couple years ago, we got a call out of the blue from our foster care agency asking if we would be willing to take our daughter's little sister for adoption, who was kind of coming to that point of needing an adoptive home. And so we said yes, and that's how come we are adoptive parents twice now.
The one thing that I'll add with the second adoption is that when we received that phone call, it was right in the middle of the chaos of this ministry just getting going. And so we had very little money at the time. In fact, I had just started doing part-time work as a package handler and delivery driver. Our house was maxed out already with space. And so that was just one of the challenges we had to wrestle through when we received the phone call is, wow, this is a lot right now going on in our life. And the reason I mention this all is because in both situations, Katie and I were caught off guard, not expecting it, but kind of challenged to go, all right, God, if you're leading us here, then we just have to trust you and say yes in this circumstance.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we wait for moments to be convenient to follow God. And I wonder if that's often why we don't follow where he's leading, because rarely does the perfect opportunity present itself in the perfect moment where everything's going perfect in our lives. And it's like, now I'll do this. No, it was very challenging seasons, to be honest. And even the process of foster care and adopting was challenging. None of this was clean and tidy and easy. And yet when we get to the biblical basis of this, does God care about these kids? And did God desire us to open up our home, a home where the love of Christ was known and taught to them, and was his heart for them, even if that meant we had to be what we would call inconvenienced or challenged or pushed outside our comfort zone? Yes.
Yeah, one of the things that we see throughout the Bible is that God talks about how he cares about the widow and the orphans and the foreigner. One passage in particular, Deuteronomy chapter 10, 17 to 18. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And what does God desire of us as Christians? James 1:27, a very famous verse. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So the Bible makes it very clear. God cares about the orphans, and he wants us to likewise care about the orphans.
But God's heart for adoption is so much more than just a couple commands. God is the ultimate adoptive father. I want to read to you from Ephesians chapter 1, and I want to read verses 3 through 6. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves. The picture of adoption, God's heart for adoption, is so powerful because what is that? That is his heart towards us. We have been adopted into the family of God. We have been brought into all the blessings and the inheritance and the riches and all the vast blessings that come with being his. And what a beautiful picture. Why does God care about the wanderer and the lost and the orphan and the fatherless? Because that's us. And he has swooped us up and claimed us as his own. So what a beautiful picture of the gospel for Christians to have that same heart for the same lost, hurting, that God has that desire to love and redeem.
So I want to read two more passages. The first is from Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Romans 8, verses 14 to 17. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. So we really like these two passages even more after having done adoption, because one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is the actual adoption court hearing that we got to be part of for our two children. And it's something you wouldn't get unless you're part of it. And so on that day when you go to the court, you are called up into the witness stand, and they ask you very clearly if you understand that by adopting this child, she becomes fully yours in every single imaginable way. First off, you can choose a new name for your child. They get a new social security number if you desire. And not only that, but all the rights that your biological children have, they have those exact same rights. They get the exact same inheritance, so to speak. They become heirs of all that we have and are. And it just really hit home going through this process twice, this picture in the Bible that as God's adopted children, we truly have all that he is and has for us as an inheritance, rightfully, because we are his adopted children.
Yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful picture, and it really took us off guard that first time. I don't think we expected to be so impacted by it. And if I think of it from our daughter's perspective, I mean, she didn't choose us. She was a tiny little baby. She had no part in this, and yet God plucked her from a situation that seemed to have a future of only brokenness. And he wrote a story for her, and he wrote her into our family, and she became ours in every sense of the word. And how cool, isn't that what God has done for us? We didn't know we needed God. We weren't searching him out. We're totally lost. And if he had not plucked us out of the darkness, if he had not redeemed us in his mercy, we would still be lost. And yet, isn't that the coolest picture that God said, you are mine? And he took us and he brought us into adoption, into a shared inheritance with Christ himself. Whoa, that is absolutely mind-boggling and incredible.
One of the things that has always struck me about God is that he would use a broken sinner like me or Katy to have any part in his redemptive work. It's the last thing we would want people to hear as we tell this story is that in any way we were somehow these perfect Christians who were ready to take on this big responsibility and all the challenges that came with it. The reality is we shared the cool moments that led us from one step to another where we could see that God was in it. And yet there is a ton of mess and challenges and hardships, and we are sinners ourselves. And so how we handled all of that was very imperfect. And yet God's grace is bigger than all of our weaknesses. And so as you hear our story and you hear about God's love for the orphans and how we are adopted, I just hope that you will at least go forward and go, I've never considered this. And as a Christian, I should consider this. Maybe I've closed the door on this and said no to God when that's not right. And so the one step I can take hearing this podcast is I am going to pray about whether God would want me to take a child into my home.
Yeah, I'm so glad Justin mentions our imperfect path on this journey, because I think you can see often the work God has done in our daughter's life, how much he has changed them and just what he's done for them. And yet I don't think it's often as clear what God did in our life through the process. God worked a lot of good. He definitely did a lot of character rebuilding and training and a lot of hard things that happened in our life over the course of years that changed who we are. And God did a lot of redemptive work in me, especially during that time. Was it painful? Yeah. Did I wish I could have avoided it? Yes. But looking back, do I see God's amazing goodness in doing that difficult work in my life and in my heart? Absolutely. And so sometimes we shy away from the messy, hard things thinking that it's going to be bad. And sometimes those hard, tough things are where God does the greatest work.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. What we've seen is that in the hardest things that God's called us to do in our life, when we have said yes and stepped out in faith, what is the greatest reward that we have received from doing that? It's that God has shown us more of himself. We've understood his character more. We've understood his truths and his word more. And it's grown our faith. It's grown our love for him. And that is something that I'm not sure you can get any other way. And so it feels invaluable that what could be better? What could be a greater blessing than following after God than to be that much closer to him in the end through it?
And I just want to close out this podcast with one last Bible verse that really sums all of this up so beautifully. 1 John 3, verse 1, see what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are.
The Discipleship Parenting Podcast is brought to you by Chosen Gen Ministry, where we are all about outfitting family discipleship. Chosen Gen is a donor-supported nonprofit ministry with a mission to encourage and equip parents as they disciple the next generation. To learn more about Chosen Gen, the resources we offer, or to financially support this work, visit chosengenministry.org. Finally, if this podcast has been an encouragement, be sure to like it, share it, or leave us a review.